"Serve me properly," Ethan Caldwell said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the soft jazz and crystal clinks of a restaurant where a single dinner bill could match a month's rent, and for a moment, everything slowed. The bartender paused mid-pour, a server froze with a tray hovering in the air, and conversations dipped into uneasy silence because everyone recognized that tone, the kind that didn't ask, didn't request, but demanded. The kind that turned people into roles instead of names. And standing in front of him, Naomi Brooks didn't react the way he expected, didn't rush, didn't apologize, didn't shrink. She simply stood there with a stillness that felt almost out of place in a room built on movement and noise, her posture straight, her expression calm, her eyes steady in a way that didn't challenge but didn't surrender either, and that was the first thing that unsettled him, though he didn't show it, because Ethan Caldwell was a man who had built $1 billion empire by controlling rooms exactly like this one, private dining floors where investors nodded before he even finished speaking, where decisions moved markets and egos filled the air thicker than the scent of aged whiskey and imported truffle oil. He was used to people adjusting themselves around him, to wait staff moving faster, to executives laughing a little louder, to silence bending in his favor, and yet Naomi didn't bend, she moved. But on her own timing, reaching for the glass with a precision that felt deliberate, placing it down with quiet control, her every action measured, almost surgical, and for a second, it made his command feel smaller than he intended, which irritated him more than he'd admit, so he leaned back slightly, letting out a faint scoff, loud enough for the table to hear, a subtle performance for the investors seated around him, men in tailored suits who watched everything without appearing to, and he added, "It's not complicated," as if simplifying her role would reinforce his own, but Naomi didn't respond with words. She adjusted the setting again, this time aligning every detail perfectly, the angle of the silverware, the spacing of the glass, the placement of the napkin, each movement so exact it drew attention rather than avoided it, and now the table was watching her instead of him, which shifted something in the air, something small but undeniable. Because in a space where power usually spoke the loudest, precision had just taken its place, and Ethan felt it, even if he couldn't name it yet. He tapped his finger once against the table, a subtle sign of impatience, a reminder of who set the pace here, but Naomi's calm didn't break, and that calm wasn't empty, it carried something beneath it, something earned, something that didn't need permission to exist in this room. And as she stepped back slightly, giving the table a clear view, one of the investors leaned forward just enough to notice the detail, the perfection, the control, and in that moment, the balance shifted again, just slightly, just enough for the room to begin asking a quiet question no one said out loud, because sometimes the person you think is serving the table is the one who understands it better than anyone else sitting at it. The room did not recover right away, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because something subtle had shifted, the kind of shift that experienced people feel before they understand it, and Ethan Caldwell felt it in the way the conversation did not immediately return to him, in the way one of the investors adjusted his posture and glanced not at Ethan, but at Naomi, as if recalibrating where attention belonged, and that was unacceptable, so Ethan smiled, the kind of polished, controlled smile that had closed deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and he leaned forward just enough to reclaim the center of the table, his voice smooth now, almost amused, as he began outlining the expansion strategy he had rehearsed, the numbers, the projections, the confident certainty of a man who expected agreement before he finished speaking, but Naomi was still there, just within the edge of the scene, refilling water, adjusting a plate, moving with that same quiet precision, and something about it began to irritate him again. Not because she was doing anything wrong, but because she was doing everything too well. Too intentionally, as if she understood the rhythm of the room better than someone in her position should, and that thought lingered just long enough to distract him for a fraction of a second, a hesitation so small most people would not notice, but the investors did, because in rooms like this, hesitation was louder than words, and one of them, a gray-haired partner who had spent decades reading people, narrowed his eyes slightly, not at Ethan, but at Naomi, as if trying to place a detail that did not fit, and that was when Ethan decided to push, to reassert control in a way everyone would recognize. He set his glass down with a soft but deliberate tap and said, "Let us make this interesting," his tone light, but edged with something sharper underneath. The kind of casual challenge that was never really optional, and he turned his attention directly to Naomi for the first time, truly looking at her now, as if acknowledging her presence only to define it. "You seem very precise," he added, just loud enough for the table to hear. "Why do not you show us how far that precision goes?" A few of the men chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar, the setup of a moment where someone like her was expected to stay in her place, and Naomi paused, not frozen, not uncertain, just still again, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to wait, because something about her stillness did not feel like compliance, it felt like choice, and when she finally moved, it was not rushed, not defensive, she simply nodded once, as if accepting a role she had already decided how to play, and that was when the balance shifted again, not loudly, not obviously, but enough for the room to lean in, because what they thought was about to happen, and what was actually about to happen, were no longer the same thing, and Naomi stepped forward just enough to enter the center of the table's attention, not hurried, not hesitant, but with a calm that felt deliberate, as if she had already seen this moment play out before it ever arrived, and Ethan watched her closely now, expecting discomfort, expecting a misstep, expecting something that would remind everyone exactly where she stood in this room. But what he saw instead unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, because Naomi did not look like someone being tested, she looked like someone measuring the test itself, and without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she began to speak, her words smooth, precise, and unmistakably fluent, not in the casual conversational French one might learn from a class or a trip, but in the structured, technical cadence of someone who understood nuance, terminology, and intent, and as her voice carried across the table, translating and refining the very details Ethan had just presented, something shifted again, this time more visibly. One investor leaned back, another tilted his head, and the grey-haired partner who had been watching from the start now set his glass down entirely, his attention fully captured, because Naomi was not just repeating information, she was correcting it, gently, almost politely, but with a clarity that made the original version feel incomplete. She pointed out a discrepancy in the projected margins, referencing international distribution costs that had not been fully accounted for, and she did it in a way that did not sound like opposition, it sounded like accuracy, and accuracy, in a room like this, carried weight. Ethan's smile held for a second longer than it should have, a fraction too tight at the edges, because he understood what was happening, even if no one had said it out loud yet. The control he had established at the beginning of the night was no longer absolute, it was being questioned, not by confrontation, but by competence, and that was far more dangerous. He leaned forward slightly, ready to interrupt, to reframe, to regain the narrative, but Naomi continued just long enough to complete her thought, her voice steady, her posture unchanged, and then she stopped. Not lingering, not seeking approval, simply allowing the silence to settle, and that silence was different now. It was no longer passive, it was charged, filled with recalculation, with investors quietly reassessing what they had just heard and what it meant, and for the first time that evening, Ethan was not the only one being evaluated. One of the men at the table cleared his throat softly and asked a follow-up question, not to Ethan, but to Naomi, and that was the moment everything truly began to shift, because attention, once redirected, rarely returns to where it was before, and Ethan felt it, not as a dramatic loss, not as a collapse, but as something far more unsettling, a gradual realization that the person he had dismissed as background had just stepped into the foreground, and had done it without asking for permission. The question hung in the air for a fraction longer than anyone expected, not because it was complicated, but because of who it was directed at, and Naomi did not rush to answer. She simply turned her attention to the investor with the same composed presence she had carried from the beginning, as if the shift in attention did not surprise her, as if she had anticipated it long before Ethan ever issued his challenge, and when she spoke again, her voice remained steady, measured, clear enough to carry across the table without forcing itself into the spotlight. She explained the margin discrepancy in precise terms, breaking down the overlooked costs into simple, undeniable pieces, referencing logistics, regional compliance, and timing delays that would quietly erode the projected returns, and as she spoke, the room leaned further into her words, not out of politeness, but because what she was saying made sense in a way that demanded attention. And that was the difference. She was not performing, she was clarifying. And clarity, in a room built on persuasion, had a way of cutting through everything else. Ethan felt it immediately. The shift was no longer subtle, it was structural. The conversation was no longer anchored to him, it was moving around her, and that was something he could not allow to continue unchecked, so he let out a small laugh, controlled, dismissive, just enough to reframe the moment as something casual, something harmless. "Interesting perspective," he said, leaning back in his chair. His tone light but edged with authority, but we have already accounted for those variables, and the statement was not just a correction, it was a signal, a reminder to the room of where expertise was supposed to sit. But Naomi did not challenge him directly, she did not contradict him in a way that would escalate the moment, instead she held his gaze for a brief second, not confrontational, just steady, and then she added, of course, her tone neutral, if the distribution contracts are finalized under the current assumptions, and that single sentence landed differently, because it did not oppose him, it exposed a condition, a gap that had not been addressed, and the grey-haired investor leaned forward slightly, his interest now fully engaged. Are you suggesting they are not? He asked, and Naomi did not hesitate, she simply reached for the tablet resting at the edge of the table, one that had been used earlier to display projections, and with a quiet, practice motion, she adjusted the screen, pulling up a section of the data that had been overlooked, not by accident, but by assumption, and she turned it just enough for the investors to see. The numbers were clear, the timing misaligned, the margins thinner than presented, and this time, no one looked at Ethan first, they looked at the screen, and then at her. And that was the moment the balance tipped, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because the room no longer needed to be told who understood the deal, it could see it, and Ethan felt the weight of that realization settle in, not as panic, not as defeat, but as something far more dangerous, the beginning of doubt, not just from others, but from within the space he had always controlled, and for the first time that night, the man who believed he owned the room realized the room was no longer entirely his. For a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not have anything to say, but because the room was recalibrating in real time, recalculating value, authority, and credibility with a quiet intensity that did not need words, and Ethan Caldwell felt it in the way the attention no longer returned to him automatically, in the way the investors lingered on the numbers displayed on the screen just a second longer than usual, as if verifying something they had previously accepted without question, and that second, that hesitation, was enough to fracture the certainty he had built his reputation on. But Ethan was not a man who lost control easily. He adjusted, quickly, smoothly, leaning forward with a composed expression that suggested nothing had changed, even as everything had, and he tapped the edge of the table lightly, drawing the focus back toward himself. Data can be interpreted in many ways, he said, his tone measured, confident, reclaiming the rhythm of leadership he knew so well, and for a brief moment, it worked. A few heads turned back toward him, the structure of the room attempting to reassert itself, but the shift had already taken root, and when one of the investors spoke again, it was not to agree, it was to question. Then why was this not addressed in the initial projection? The grey-haired partner asked, his voice calm but precise. And that question did not challenge Naomi, it challenged Ethan, and that was the difference, because now the conversation was no longer about a server stepping out of place, it was about a leader defending his position, and Ethan felt the pressure of that distinction settle in, subtle but undeniable. He opened his mouth to respond, ready with an explanation, a reframing, a way to redirect the narrative back into his control. But before he could fully deliver it, Naomi spoke again, not interrupting, not overriding, simply adding, it is a common oversight when timelines are compressed, her tone neutral, almost helpful, as if she were offering him a way out, and for a split second, the room held its breath, because what she had just done was not confrontation, it was positioning. She had shifted the mistake from personal failure to systemic oversight, giving Ethan a path to recover. And that was the moment that confused him the most, because he had expected resistance, defiance, something he could push against, but instead he was given space, and that space felt more dangerous than opposition, because it exposed something he had not anticipated, that she was not trying to win against him, she was operating on a level that made the concept of winning irrelevant, and the investors saw it too, the subtle control, the quiet authority, the way she guided the conversation without forcing it. And one of them leaned back, studying her with a new kind of interest, not as staff, not as background, but as someone who belonged in the discussion, and that recognition, once formed, could not be undone. Ethan straightened slightly, his composure still intact, but the certainty behind it no longer absolute, because the room had changed, and for the first time that night, the power he carried into it was no longer unquestioned, it was being measured, compared, and quietly, unmistakably, shared. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore, it felt weighted. Like every person at the table was now listening for something more than just numbers, more than just projections, they were listening for certainty, and for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell could feel that certainty slipping just slightly out of his grasp, not enough to alarm anyone, but enough to change the tone, enough to shift the balance, and in rooms like this, tone was everything. He adjusted his posture again, subtle, controlled, his hands folding together as he leaned forward, reclaiming physical space if not complete authority. "We are moving fast because the market demands it," he said, his voice steady, confident, the voice of a man who had justified risk many times before and been rewarded for it. Speed always carries variables, and that statement landed with some weight, a few nods returning, the structure attempting to stabilize, but it did not fully reset. Because now every word was being measured against what had already been revealed, and Naomi remained still at the edge of the table, not stepping further in, not stepping back, simply present in a way that no longer allowed her to disappear, and that presence itself was beginning to redefine the space. One of the younger investors glanced between Ethan and Naomi, his expression thoughtful, calculating, and then he asked, "And if those variables expand beyond projection, what is the contingency?" And this time, the question was directed to Ethan, but it carried the weight of what Naomi had introduced. It was no longer a routine inquiry, it was a test, and Ethan recognized it instantly. He responded without hesitation, outlining a fallback strategy, confident, structured, the kind of answer that had secured trust in countless rooms before. But even as he spoke, there was a subtle shift in how it was received. Not blind acceptance, but quiet evaluation, because once doubt enters a room, it does not leave easily, it lingers, it listens, it compares, and Naomi, without interrupting, without challenging, simply added a single line when the moment allowed. That would depend on how quickly the discrepancy is identified, her tone even, her words precise, and that addition did not contradict Ethan, it extended the thought, but in doing so, it highlighted a gap again, not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly enough for the investors to notice, and the grey-haired partner leaned back, exhaling slowly, his gaze shifting between the two of them, not as superior and subordinate, but as two sources of information, two perspectives to weigh, and that was the moment the hierarchy truly fractured, not visibly, not dramatically, but fundamentally, because the room was no longer anchored to one voice, it was balancing between two, and Ethan felt it, not as a loss he could point to, but as a pressure he could not ignore. A realization forming beneath the surface that this was no longer just about a deal, it was about perception, about credibility, about who the room believed when the numbers became uncertain, and for a man who had built his entire identity on being the one everyone believed, that shift, however small, was the beginning of something far more difficult to control than any negotiation he had ever faced. The air in the room no longer moved the way it had at the beginning of the night, it did not flow around Ethan Caldwell anymore, it circled, paused, shifted between voices, between perspectives, and that subtle redistribution of attention was something no amount of confidence could immediately reclaim, and Ethan knew it, even if his expression did not show it. He adjusted his cuff slightly, a controlled movement, a reminder to himself more than anyone else that he was still composed, still in control, but control, in that moment, had become something that needed to be demonstrated, not assumed. And across the table, the grey-haired partner leaned forward again, his fingers resting lightly against the polished surface, his voice calm but carrying a weight that now demanded clarity. "You mentioned timing discrepancies," he said, directing his words toward Naomi, not as a challenge, but as an invitation, and that distinction mattered, because invitations in rooms like this were rarely extended without reason. And Naomi did not hesitate, she stepped slightly closer, not into dominance, but into relevance, her presence aligning naturally with the conversation rather than forcing its way into it. "Yes," she said, her tone steady, "the projected rollout assumes simultaneous compliance approvals across multiple regions," and as she spoke, the words did not feel like an interruption, they felt like a continuation of logic the room was already following. "In reality, those approvals are staggered," she continued, "which delays revenue recognition by at least 2 quarters. And the numbers landed softly, but their impact was immediate. One of the investors exhaled quietly, another leaned back with a thoughtful expression, recalculating in real time, and Ethan felt the shift tighten, not explode, just tighten, like a knot forming beneath the surface. He moved to respond, to regain narrative ground, but this time, the pause before he spoke was not his to control, because the room had already begun to process Naomi's point independently, and independence in perception was something no leader could override once it took hold. "That adjustment is already factored into our secondary projections," Ethan said, his voice still measured, still confident, but now carrying a trace of defense beneath its surface, subtle, almost undetectable. but present enough for experienced ears to catch, and Naomi nodded once, acknowledging his statement without resistance, without agreement, just acknowledgement, and then she added, secondary projections that are not reflected in the valuation being presented tonight, and that was the moment the tension sharpened, not through conflict, but through precision, because she had not contradicted him, she had clarified the discrepancy between what was known and what was shown, and that distinction carried weight, the kind of weight that did not need volume to be felt, and the grey-haired partner leaned back slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. So the valuation is based on an optimistic timeline, he said. More to the table than to either of them, and no one answered immediately, because the answer was already there, sitting in the space Naomi had just defined, and Ethan felt it, the realization that the conversation had moved beyond his framing, beyond his control, into a space where facts, not authority, dictated direction, and for the first time that night, the man who had entered the room expecting to lead it found himself having to keep up with it, and across from him, Naomi did not look victorious, she did not look confrontational, she simply stood there, composed, present, as if she had not taken anything from him at all, but had only revealed what had been there all along. The silence did not break this time, it deepened, settling over the table like something heavier than discomfort, something closer to realization, because what Naomi had just done was not challenge Ethan Caldwell directly. She had reframed the foundation beneath him, and once a foundation is questioned, everything built on top of it begins to feel less certain. The investors were no longer reacting, they were thinking, and thinking was slower, quieter, far more dangerous than immediate agreement. One of them reached for his glass but did not drink, another tapped his finger lightly against the table as if recalculating numbers that no longer aligned the way they had moments before, and Ethan saw it all, every micro movement, every subtle shift in posture. He had built his career on reading rooms like this, on sensing momentum before it became visible, and now that same instinct was telling him something he did not want to acknowledge, that momentum had moved, not completely, not irreversibly, but enough to matter, enough to require action. So he straightened slightly, his voice returning with a calm authority that had not disappeared, only been tested. Valuation models always involve forward assumptions, he said, his tone even, controlled, the kind of statement designed to stabilize uncertainty, to bring the conversation back into familiar territory. What matters is the strength of execution, and that line landed with some effect, a few nods returning, the room attempting to rebalance, because confidence, when delivered correctly, could still anchor attention, but Naomi did not counter it, she did not interrupt, she simply listened, her expression unchanged, and then, when the moment allowed, she added, execution depends on clarity, her voice quiet, but placed precisely where it needed to be heard, and that single sentence did something Ethan's statement had not. It did not redirect, it refined, it narrowed the focus, and in doing so, it made the room lean in again, because clarity was not an abstract concept, it was measurable, it was something they could verify, and the grey-haired partner nodded slowly, almost to himself. Then let us be clear, he said, his gaze moving between Ethan and Naomi, but lingering just a second longer on her. What is the realistic timeline if approvals are staggered? And that question was no longer hypothetical, it was direct, grounded in the gap Naomi had exposed, and this time, before Ethan could answer, before he could reclaim the narrative fully, Naomi responded, not quickly, not aggressively, but with a certainty that did not need urgency. She outlined the adjusted timeline, quarter by quarter, explaining how delays would ripple through revenue recognition, how projections would need to shift to maintain accuracy, and as she spoke, the room followed, not because she demanded attention, but because what she said aligned with the logic they trusted, and that was the moment the shift became undeniable, because trust, once redirected, does not return easily. Ethan remained composed, his posture still confident, but inside the structure of the room, something fundamental had changed. The conversation was no longer orbiting him, it was expanding beyond him. And across the table, Naomi did not look like she had taken control, she looked like she had revealed it, and that distinction was what made it impossible to ignore. By now, the room had stopped pretending this was a routine dinner, the polished ease that once filled the space had given way to something sharper, quieter, more deliberate. Every glance carried weight, every pause held meaning, and Ethan Caldwell could feel it in the way no one interrupted Naomi anymore, in the way questions now followed her answers instead of his, not out of disrespect, but out of recalibration. And recalibration was something no leader could ignore. He adjusted his posture again, slower this time, more measured, as if every movement now needed to be intentional, because intention was the only thing left fully under his control. Those projections assume conservative friction, he said, his voice steady, still carrying authority, but now layered with precision, as if tightening his words could tighten the room again. Our partnerships reduce that delay significantly, and for a brief moment, the statement held. A few investors nodded, considering the possibility, weighing the confidence behind it, but before that momentum could fully form, the grey-haired partner spoke again, his tone neutral but focused. Then those partnerships should be reflected in the data we are seeing, and that was the shift, not loud, not confrontational, but decisive, because now the room was no longer accepting statements without alignment, it was demanding consistency, and Ethan felt it, the narrowing of tolerance, the tightening of expectation, and across from him, Naomi did not step forward, did not claim space, she simply remained where she was, her presence steady, her attention precise, and when she spoke again, it was not to counter, but to complete the picture. Some of those agreements are still pending final signatures, she said, her tone even, her words placed carefully, which means they are not yet operational, and that clarification landed with quiet finality, not as an opinion, but as a fact, and facts, in a room like this, carried a different kind of authority, one that did not rely on tone or position, but on alignment with reality, and the investors felt it immediately. One of them leaned forward, his brow tightening slightly, another exchanged a brief glance with the partner beside him. The kind of glance that communicated more than words, and Ethan saw it all. Every subtle signal, every shift in energy, and for the first time that evening, he did not move to immediately fill the silence, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood what the room was doing. It was no longer reacting, it was deciding, and decisions, once formed in silence, were far harder to influence. The grey-haired partner leaned back slowly, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still. Then the valuation assumes outcomes that are not fully secured, he said, not asking, not accusing, simply stating what had now become clear, and no one rushed to correct him, no one moved to soften the conclusion, because the logic had already been laid out, piece by piece, calmly, precisely, until it could no longer be ignored. And across the table, Naomi stood exactly as she had from the beginning, composed, quiet, unchanged, but everything around her had shifted. Because she had not forced the room to see anything, she had simply made it impossible not to see, and in that moment, the power in the room did not belong to the loudest voice or the highest title, it belonged to the person who aligned the truth clearly enough that everyone else had to follow it. No one rushed to speak after that, not even Ethan Caldwell, and that was the moment that changed everything, not the data, not the projections, but the silence itself, because silence, in a room like this, was never empty. It was filled with decisions forming beneath the surface, quiet, irreversible, and Ethan felt it, the subtle but undeniable shift from evaluation to conclusion, from possibility to judgment. He leaned back slightly, his posture still composed, but the ease that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something tighter, more controlled, as if every movement now required effort. Every deal carries risk, he said finally, his voice steady, deliberate. An attempt to reframe the narrative one last time, to pull the conversation back into territory he understood. The question is whether the upside justifies it, and for a brief second, the room listened, because that was the language they all spoke, risk and reward, projection and return. But the difference now was not in what he said, it was in how it was received. The words did not land with the same authority, they landed as one perspective among others, and that distinction, subtle as it was, marked the turning point. The grey-haired partner nodded slowly, acknowledging the statement, but not conceding to it. Then the upside should be presented with the same clarity as the risk, he replied, his tone calm, but final in a way that did not invite debate. And that was when Ethan understood something he had not anticipated. This was no longer a room he could lead through confidence alone. This was a room that required alignment, and alignment was something he no longer fully controlled. Across the table, Naomi did not move, did not react, she simply stood there, her presence unchanged, but now impossible to ignore. And one of the investors turned to her directly, his voice measured, thoughtful. If the timeline adjusts and the agreements are finalized later than expected, what does the realistic valuation look like? And that question, simple as it sounded, carried the weight of the entire room, because it was no longer about defending what had been presented, it was about redefining it, and Naomi answered without hesitation, her voice calm, precise, outlining the adjusted valuation based on verified timelines. not assumptions, her explanation clear, structured, grounded in logic that did not need embellishment, and as she spoke, the room followed, not because they had to, but because what she said aligned with what they were already beginning to believe, and when she finished, there was no immediate response. Just a quiet pause as the implication settled in, numbers recalculated, expectations reset, and then the grey-haired partner leaned back, exhaling slowly, his decision forming not through emotion, but through clarity. "We will need to revisit the terms," he said, his voice steady, not harsh, not dramatic, but definitive, and that was it, not a collapse, not a confrontation, just a shift, clean and complete, and Ethan sat there, still composed, still controlled, but no longer at the center. Because the center had moved, not to Naomi as a person, but to the truth she had made visible, and in that moment, the room belonged not to the one who spoke the loudest, but to the one who made everything else make sense. No one applauded, no one reacted with surprise, because in rooms like this, the most powerful moments were never loud, they were quiet, controlled, and final, and as the word settled, the shift became permanent, not dramatic, not explosive, just undeniable, the kind of change that did not need to announce itself because everyone could feel it. Ethan Caldwell sat still for a fraction longer than usual, his expression composed, his posture intact, but something behind it had changed, something subtle but irreversible, the kind of realization that did not show on the surface but altered everything underneath. He nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the decision without resistance. Because resistance, in that moment, would have only confirmed what the room had already concluded, and across the table, the investors began to move again, not hurried, not chaotic, just deliberate, glasses lifted, notes adjusted, quiet exchanges forming between them as the structure of the evening reset itself around a new center of gravity, and that center was no longer defined by title or position. It was defined by clarity, and Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she had been, just at the edge of the table, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if nothing significant had happened at all, and that was what made it so powerful. She had not stepped forward to claim authority, she had simply allowed the truth to take its place, and the room had followed it naturally. One of the investors turned toward her again, this time not with curiosity, but with recognition. "How long have you been working with this data?" he asked. His tone respectful, measured, and the question carried a different weight now. It was no longer about testing her, it was about understanding her, and Naomi met his gaze calmly, long enough to know where it bends. She replied, her voice even, and that answer did not sound like a boast, it sounded like experience, like insight earned over time rather than claimed in the moment, and the grey-haired partner gave a slight nod, as if confirming something he had already begun to suspect. Because people like him did not miss patterns, they recognized them, and what he saw in Naomi was not accidental, it was consistent, precise, grounded, and far more valuable than it had first appeared. Ethan remained quiet, not withdrawn, not defeated, but observant now, watching the room with the same intensity he once used to control it, only now he was learning from it, and that shift, that willingness to observe instead of dominate, was the first sign of something deeper than loss. It was the beginning of understanding, and for the first time that night, the man who had entered expecting to lead the room realized that leadership was not about commanding attention, it was about aligning with truth, and truth, as it turned out, did not belong to him alone. The room did not return to what it was, it reorganized itself into something quieter, sharper, more aware. Conversations resumed but with a different tone, no longer driven by assumption or momentum, but by consideration, by a need to understand rather than simply agree. And Ethan Caldwell remained seated at the center of it all, but the center no longer meant what it had at the beginning of the night. It was no longer a position of automatic influence, it was a place of observation, and he adjusted to it, not outwardly, not in a way anyone could point to, but internally, where the shift mattered most. He reached for his glass, not as a gesture of control, but as a pause, a moment to recalibrate, and across from him, Naomi Brooks moved again, not stepping away, not retreating into invisibility, but continuing her work with the same calm precision she had carried from the start, refilling glasses, adjusting settings, moving through the space as if the entire evening had not just redefined the room, and that continuity, that refusal to change her demeanor, was what made her presence even more undeniable, because it suggested that nothing about what had just happened was unusual for her, that this level of clarity, this level of awareness, was not an exception. It was her standard. One of the investors stood, stretching slightly as he gathered his notes, and before turning away, he looked at Naomi again, not as staff, not as background, but with a recognition that carried weight. "If you are ever open to consulting," he said, his tone respectful, direct, "I would be interested in that conversation." And Naomi nodded once, not surprised, not eager, just acknowledging the possibility without attaching herself to it, and that response, quiet and grounded, only reinforced what the room had already begun to understand, that she was not seeking validation, she was operating from something far more stable than approval. Ethan watched the exchange closely, not with frustration, not with resistance, but with a growing awareness that what he had witnessed was not a disruption, it was a correction, not of his authority, but of his perspective, and that realization settled in slowly, reshaping the way he saw the evening, not as a loss, but as a lesson he had not expected to receive. The grey-haired partner approached him briefly, placing a hand lightly on the back of the chair, his voice low, private. "We will revisit this with adjusted clarity," he said, not dismissing, not criticizing, just stating what needed to happen next, and Ethan nodded, understanding now that clarity was not something you controlled, it was something you aligned with. And as the room gradually dispersed, the noise returning in soft waves, the music rising again, the rhythm of the restaurant restoring itself, one truth remained, quiet but permanent, that power, when built on assumption, can shift in an instant, but power rooted in truth does not need to move at all. And across the room, Naomi Brooks continued her work, unchanged, as if she had not taken anything from the night, but had simply revealed what had always been there, waiting to be seen. By the time the last glass was cleared and the final notes were tucked away, the room had returned to its polished rhythm, but it was not the same room that had existed an hour earlier. Something invisible had shifted, something that did not belong to the decor or the lighting or the music, but to the way people saw each other. And Ethan Caldwell stood slowly from his chair, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, his movements measured as if he were stepping into a version of himself that had been quietly forming throughout the night. He adjusted his jacket, glanced once across the table where the conversation had unraveled and reformed, and then his eye settled briefly on Naomi Brooks, who was placing a glass down with the same calm precision she had carried from the very beginning, and for a moment, he simply watched, not with judgment, not with superiority, but with recognition, the kind that does not come easily to someone who has spent years being the one others recognize. And he took a step toward her, not as a command, not as a gesture of control, but as something quieter, more intentional. "You saw what I missed," he said, his voice low, steady, stripped of the performance it once carried, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, not defiant, not submissive, just present, and she gave a small nod, not claiming credit, not softening the truth, simply acknowledging it. And that exchange, brief as it was, carried more weight than anything else that had been said that night, because it was not about winning or losing, it was about seeing clearly, something neither of them had fully done at the beginning. And Ethan exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in understanding. "Clarity," he added, almost to himself, and Naomi responded with a quiet certainty that did not need emphasis. "It is always there," she said, "people just decide when to look for it." And that was the lesson, not spoken as a lecture, not framed as a correction, but offered as something simple, something undeniable. And Ethan nodded once more, not as agreement, but as acceptance, because some truths do not need to be debated. They only need to be recognized. And as he turned to leave, the room continued on around them, conversations resuming, deals shifting, the night moving forward as if nothing had happened, but everything had, because power had changed shape, not in a way anyone could point to directly, but in a way everyone would remember. And Naomi returned to her work, unchanged, unannounced, moving through the space with the same quiet control she had always carried, as if she had not altered the course of the evening at all. And maybe that was the point, she had not forced anything to change, she had simply revealed what was already there. And as the lights reflected off polished glass and soft music filled the air once more, one truth lingered, steady and unshaken, that power can fill a room, but clarity can redefine it. And on that night, the man who believed he owned the room walked away understanding that ownership means nothing if you cannot see what stands right in front of you.